You're listening to The Mind Manual, episode 25, The Importance of Our Enteric Brain. If you want a particular result in your life, but you're unable to get it, tune in to start training your brain and expanding your emotional intelligence to unlock the most powerful and underutilized performance tool that we have. It's the most important work you could do because it affects every area of your life. Hello. I hope you've been well and having fun with the challenge of the dare I suggested in the last episode. It's such a great exercise to go against everything we ever believed something to be true and then see what it brings up for us. If we've gone and wrapped our identity around a particular belief and then based our life upon it, it can disturb us to our core. When we can shatter these illusions, it can often feel as if our foundations have started to crack and move, which can feel very unsettling. And to the primal brain, it's like the world is ending. But we know we can override all of this with our higher thinking brain by reassuring ourselves that we are safe as we go about busting a few myths and knocking down some walls. With all that aside, did you fiercely love anyway? And how did that feel? I bet it was a whole lot better than living in a constant state of resentment and discontent. Today's session might seem a bit off topic, but it's really not. I've talked a lot about our primal, more evolutionary, reactive brain that sits at the base near the brainstem, and also the higher brain that sits more at the front, on top. It has more of an executive function and is in charge of the logical, rational, deductive thinking. So it's able to override this primitive aspect that has to do with survival. At times, it can feel as if there's this tug-of-war game going on between the two. Intellectually, we might be able to reason our way through something, but often our primal brain will go and hijack the show because it activates the emotional center of our brain called the amygdala through the primal fear response whenever it thinks we're going to die, which I might add is quite often. This could come in the form of a hunger pang whenever we think we've been excluded from the pack, or we go and dramatize the worst case scenario about something. We're constantly hitting the panic button, courtesy of our very overreactive primal brain. So when our brain releases all of the stress hormones throughout the body in response to these fearful thoughts, in order to prepare us for fight or flight, we have this visceral, physical sensation that takes over, we describe as an emotion. And at this point, our higher reasoning brain goes offline. The activation of this instinctual survival system takes priority because there's no longer any time to sit down and think about things. It's now time to run or stay and defend. And so the focus and attention of our brain gets diverted to our external environment and sensory perceptions, which demands quick reflexive action, given it thinks our life is in danger. So even though our higher brain might intellectually know that there is no real life-threatening situation going on, our body has just been G'd up for a fight or run of its life. And it feels so real and overwhelming that it becomes all-consuming. And we just react instead of stopping to think about it and questioning all of it. We have this battle of, I'm going to die. No, you're not. Yes, I am. You're being stupid. Let's get out of here. There's something wrong with you. It's like an argument that goes on between the two that can feel like we're acting almost against our own will. Most of us are not even aware that these shenanigans are going on behind the scenes. It's this unconscious battle that happens beneath the surface, and we wonder why we feel on edge. So while these two brains are having it out with one another, let's now go and throw a third brain into this terrible mix. It's called the enteric brain. This is one you may have never heard about, and it's also one that conventional doctors really know nothing about. It's the ecosystem of our gut, or microbiome, which is a community of over 100 trillion microbes living inside our bodies, which reside mostly in our colon. It's a complex system of 800 different species of microbiota, which includes 7,000 different strains of various bacteria, viruses, fungi, bacteriophages, and archaea. But before we explore this further, I just want to touch on why I'm talking about the health of our body on a podcast with the title of The Mind Manual, which leads into the question of what really is the mind? Well, the Oxford Dictionary describes the mind as the element of a person that enables them to be aware of the world and their experiences, to think and to feel, the faculty of consciousness and thought. And two, a person's ability to think and reason, the intellect. When you consider the factors that affect and impact our ability to think, feel, and reason, it brings to light the direct relationship we have between our physical dimension, being our brain and body, and the influence it has to produce an effect on our non-physical dimension, being our mind and spirit. In this human form, we therefore have an interdependent relationship between these two dimensions. One cannot exist without the other if we want to call ourselves a human. So let's go through some of the ways our physical health impacts our mind and vice versa when it comes to the enteric brain. Emerging evidence indicates that gut microbiota plays an important role in the regulation of brain activity and cognitive functions. Microbes mediate communication among the metabolic, peripheral immune, and central nervous systems via the microbiota-gut-brain axis. This gut-brain axis, which includes the central nervous, endocrine, and immune systems, is an information exchange network that connects the gut and the brain. It can transmit information bidirectionally, top down from the brain to the gut, and bottom up from the gut to the brain via the physical connection of the vagal nerves. There's one vagus nerve on each side of our body that runs from the lower part of the brain through the neck to the chest and down into the stomach. The fascinating thing about the gut microbiota and the enteric system is that it produces many of the neurotransmitters, enzymes, and precursors needed to regulate our body and brain. It transports these into the brain either through the blood-brain barrier or the vagus nerve. Neurotransmitters are chemicals that can be transported between neurons via synapses to carry messages between nerve cells to control behaviors such as motility, emotion, memory, etc. Besides short-chain fatty acids and bile acids, recent studies have identified a subpopulation of enteroendocrine cells in the intestine and specific bacteria in the gut that are responsible for producing over 90% of the total serotonin in the body, over 50% of the dopamine in the body, and many other important neurotransmitters such as acetylcholine, GABA, glutamate, norepinephrine, as well as trace amines that act as neuromodulators or neurotransmitters. Numerous studies have shown how when changes in intestinal microbial abundance are altered, with one study using antibiotic administration that led to the acquired deprivation of gut bacteria, it shows that it also alters the levels of neurotransmitters and their precursors in the gut and blood, as well as altering the expression of neurotransmitter receptors within the brain. Interestingly, changes in dietary habits and environment, such as a high carbohydrate-rich diet and temperature changes, significantly influenced intestinal microbial composition and contributed to changes in neurotransmitter levels in the feces, the blood, and the central nervous system. These findings collectively demonstrate an association between a healthy gut microbiome structure and balanced neurotransmitter levels. So let's take a look at the role of these neurotransmitters in the body in terms of our physical and brain functions. Substantial recent evidence indicates that the intestinal microbial composition is altered in neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, and that these alterations are accompanied by gastrointestinal disorders. In the last decade, numerous studies have demonstrated an association between the dysregulation of neurotransmitters, including glutamate, acetylcholine, dopamine, GABA, serotonin, and norepinephrine, and the impairment in Alzheimer's disease. There was a recent case report of a patient with Alzheimer's who displayed rapid improvement in memory and mood after a fecal microbiota transplantation from a healthy donor. Then we have Parkinson's disease, which is characterized by the dysregulation of the dopamine system. Several clinical trials with fecal transplants from healthy controls to patients with Parkinson's have demonstrated significant effects on reducing motor symptoms and improving non-motor symptoms, such as the quality of life and sleep, and relieving anxiety and depression, as well as constipation in Parkinson's disease patients. The autism spectrum disorder has been found to be associated with the dysregulation of glutamate, dopamine, and serotonin in the brains of patients. Increases in very specific gut bacteria have been identified and detected in patients with autism, and recent studies have focused on establishing rodent models of autism using fecal transplantation from children with autism. And this enabled the investigation of the causal relationship between the gut microbiota and autism symptoms. Transplantation of feces from children with autism induces autism-like behaviours as well as tryptophan and serotonin metabolism in germ-free recipient mice. Another study reported that an autism rat model and transplantation with fecal samples from children with autism results in a decrease in the serum levels of GABA and norepinephrine, leading to an increase in the serum level of serotonin and increases in the abundance of lactobacillus and Collinsella, which are specific beneficial bacteria. These results suggest that a typical gut microbial composition from patients with a certain disorder can trigger disease symptoms that are usually accompanied by alterations in neurotransmitter levels. Meanwhile, dysregulation of the dopamine system has also been characterized in schizophrenia. Patients with schizophrenia exhibit increased abundance of gut anaerobes, which can survive in the presence or absence of oxygen. Mice transplanted with fecal microbiota from patients with schizophrenia exhibited impaired learning and memory abilities that mimic those observed in the donors. These mice also exhibit lower serum levels of tryptophan and serotonin, as well as higher levels of dopamine and serotonin in the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus. The presence of a single species, Streptococcus vestibularis, which is associated with schizophrenia, was sufficient to induce schizophrenia-like social behaviours in recipient mice. The dysregulation of serotonin, GABA, dopamine, and glutamate levels in the central nervous system are also associated with disorders like anxiety. Recent studies provide evidence that gut microbiota affects anxiety symptoms. Administration with probiotics such as Lactobacillus rhamnosus were shown to regulate the mRNA levels of GABA in distinct regions of the brain, including the cortex, hippocampus, and the amygdala, which showed to improve anxiety and depression-like behaviours in mice. It was noted that these effects were not experienced in mice that had a vagotomy, which is a surgical operation where one or more branches of the vagus nerve are cut. This study implied there is a crucial connection between the bacteria and the brain through the vagal nerve pathway. Meanwhile, patients with depression exhibit dysregulation of GABA, serotonin, and dopamine levels. Patients with depression also exhibited increased intestinal leakage and bacterial translocation, implying the low-level inflammatory reaction caused by the intestinal leakage can lead to altered brain function and behaviour. It was also shown that a transplantation of fecal microbiota from a mouse model of depression will induce depressive-like behaviours in germ-free recipient mice. The administration of probiotic Lactobacillus plantarum was able to restore normal behaviour. All of these findings support the microbiota-gut-brain axis hypothesis, which has led to the discovery of microbe-derived drugs for the treatment of brain diseases. Many other microbial therapies are in development, such as GABA-producing intestinal bacteria for IBS and insomnia, which is all very exciting stuff. So when I was at the gym the other day, one of the morning show headlines appeared on the television announcing that it was World Microbiome Day, which surprised me because for the last 2 years, the subject of our microbiome has consumed me. It's been a lonesome journey of feeling around in the dark, trying to figure it all out without any answers from our modern day health system, which is why I've gone down this track of doing all this research. It's certainly not something you will learn about in the mainstream medical model. So I'm doing my bit and sharing it with you here. When my son was 12 years old, he had a case of food poisoning and tested positive to a Campylobacter infection. He got sick and never recovered. The lead paediatric gastroenterologist of Sydney Children's Hospital diagnosed him with post-infectious irritable bowel syndrome. His main symptoms were chronic debilitating nausea, cramping, and abdominal pain, which progressed to constipation and now dysfunction in the upper digestional tract that has led to GERD, which stands for gastroesophageal reflux disease. It presents with an open and spasming esophageal sphincter, which is the muscle that joins the stomach and the esophagus. When that muscle is dysfunctioning, which is due once again to an imbalance in the gut microbiome, it stays open when it should be closed. And all of the stomach acid comes up into the esophagus, burning the tissue lining. And over time, those damaged and corroded cells can turn malignant, and there you have cancer. At other times, this dysfunctioning sphincter muscle can stay closed when it's meant to be open, which results in food not being able to empty into the stomach, and so it backs up into the esophagus, causing regurgitation and even aspiration of food into the lungs. So this has been my life for the past 2 years with my son, who has missed most of his schooling during this time. And I know he's not alone. They estimate 15 to 20% of the world's population, which includes both diagnosed and undiagnosed people, have either IBS and or GERD. And I'm guessing for most of these people, this conversation I'm having with you will be the first time you're hearing about all of this. This is because our doctors have been trained up by Big Pharma to essentially treat a symptom with a pill. It's Big Pharma that are funding all of the evidence-based research that is required to fit within the conventional medical model. And since the pharmaceutical industry are the ones with all the money, they'll direct it in ways that will ensure they have customers for life. Big Pharma knows that if you never rebalance your microbiome in the gut, which you can do naturally, then you're on protein pump inhibitors, most likely for the rest of your life. Here in Australia, our most common brand of PPIs, called Nexium, has been recently removed from the PBS list that requires a doctor to prescribe it for you in order to purchase it. That's because there are so many people on it now that it's become unaffordable for the health system to keep funding us to see a doctor to get our prescriptions renewed. So it's now an over-the-counter item for anyone to buy. This medication itself causes a whole host of other problems on its own down the track. So most of our doctors and specialists have no idea that over 90% of the serotonin in the body is produced by the microbiome in the gut. And yet there are serotonin receptors in nearly every organ in our body that this neurotransmitter is helping to function properly. Serotonin is responsible for regulating nearly the whole digestional tract. It plays a major role in gut motility and is one of the primary neurotransmitters for maintaining gut distension and motility, which is that peristalsis action that is necessary to push the food through the colon, as well as visceral sensitivity. So patients with irritable bowel syndrome of the diarrhea subtype have increased serotonin production and availability in the gut, which increases motility and causes diarrhea and pain. In a study with mice that had decreased serotonin levels in the intestine, they found their fecal pellets were larger than normal because of the lack of serotonin-induced peristalsis. Researchers found that about 55% of patients treated with selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors showed to improve their IBS symptoms versus 33% for the placebo group. So if we have an imbalance in our microbiome, then it will naturally follow that we're going to have an imbalance in our serotonin. Serotonin also regulates our mood. If you look at the action of antidepressant drugs that a huge percentage of the population are on, they come from a class of drugs called SSRI, which stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So basically, they suppress the body's ability of reuptaking the serotonin out of circulation so that there are higher levels of it left in the body to help regulate our mood. And if we were to go to the level of addressing the underlying cause, as opposed to treating the symptom and restoring the balance of our microbiome, we would not only restore the balance of serotonin, but all the other essential neurotransmitters that are required for a well-functioning mind and body. With such a complex environment as the microbiome, there is no way we're going to do it as well as our natural system can when it's all in balance. Serotonin is just one neurotransmitter that all play different roles in regulating different emotions. We have serotonin that regulates disgust and sadness, dopamine that regulates our joy, norepinephrine, which regulates our fear and anger. And then there's everything else in between. So taking a pill that allows serotonin to stay in the body for a bit longer is just not going to cut it, as most people who are on antidepressants will tell you. So while most people assume that these serotonin-focused medications work in most cases, studies show that 30 to 40% of people who take them for anxiety did not improve, and many others experience only partial improvement or uncomfortable side effects. This reflects the often overlooked fact that serotonin theory has never been validated in the scientific literature as the primary or only cause for anxiety. It should therefore come as no surprise that a subset of patients will not get better with these medications. Contrast this to type 1 diabetes, where the cause, being the body's inability to produce or use insulin, has been clearly established, and nearly everyone gets better with treatment in taking prescription insulin. Dr. Chandra, an integrative psychiatrist trained at Harvard and Yale universities, describes anxiety as being like a fever, telling us that something is dysregulated, requiring attention and treatment. In this way, she says it should be seen more as a symptom rather than as disease itself. Second, we need to look beyond the brain at the whole system in the body to fully understand and address anxiety. She goes on to say, in my practice, patients with anxiety often complain of physical symptoms such as chronic fatigue, chest pain, stomach bloating, headaches, and body aches. Often doctors ignore possible connections between these systems and anxiety, or assume they've been caused by the anxiety. With careful listening and thorough testing, however, I've come to understand that these symptoms often indicate underlying medical conditions that are connected to and possibly causing anxiety. Whereas most doctors today treat each of the body's systems separately, the reality is that all of the body systems depend and work in concert with one another. Brain health and function can only be understood in the context of a whole body health. It just so happens that these symptoms of IBS and gut dysbiosis, which is an imbalance in the gut microbiota, do include bloating, abdominal pain and cramping, constipation, diarrhea, all mixed, burping, flatulence, indigestion, reflux, heartburn, food intolerances, fatigue, brain fog, anxiety, depression, joint pain, skin conditions, and of course, the dreaded nausea. It's common for anxiety and digestive problems to go hand in hand. You may have noticed that during stressful times, you're more likely to suffer from constipation or diarrhea. It's therefore easy to see how anxiety is related to irritable bowel syndrome. It's a common problem that causes abnormal bowel movements. But we only hear about it going one way, from the brain to the gut. They've missed the connection of the bidirectional gut-brain axis, being responsible for the transmission of signals from the gut, the enteric brain, up to the brain in our head, where it can actually be the cause of anxiety in the first instance. You can see how easy it would be for then it to keep cycling around in a continuous biofeedback loop from the brain to the gut, then back to the brain, and around she goes. Studies have shown that mood disorders like anxiety and depression are more common in people with IBS. In one study of patients with IBS, the prevalence of anxiety was 44% and that of depression was 84%. This was in contrast to healthy controls, where the prevalence of anxiety was 8% and that of depression just 6%. So let's look at why anxiety and bowel problems may be related. The mind and the gut are intertwined, as we discovered, in what scientists call the gut-brain axis. This is a two-way signaling system between our brain and digestive tract. So our thoughts, feelings, and environment all lead to a release of chemicals that are activated by the brain. These chemicals then affect different processes in our body. With IBS and anxiety, the theory is that when you think and therefore feel anxious, your body releases stress-related chemicals to your gut. The result is abdominal pain, a change in your gut bacteria, and abnormal bowel movements. In the other direction, a poorly functioning gut has been linked to mental health changes. This has now been shown, as we've discussed, because our brain depends on chemicals and hormones that are made by the bacteria in our gut. So we have this multi-directional effect along the gut-brain axis, where one is interdependent on the other. Poor mental health can lead to an imbalance in gut health, and poor gut health can lead to improper brain function. The other thing that has shown to greatly affect our neurotransmitter levels is exercise. In a recent clinical study, which encompassed 97 meta-reviews of over 1,000 randomized control trials involving 128,000 participants that evaluated differing forms of exercise in varying doses. They also involved different population subgroups, comparing them to different control groups. And what they found was that physical activity was 1.5 times more effective at reducing mild to moderate symptoms of depression, psychological stress, and anxiety than medication or cognitive behavior therapy, according to the study's lead author, Dr. Beng Singh. The effect may occur, it was said, through physiological and biochemical mechanisms, including endorphins, mitochondria, mammalian target of rapamycin, neurotransmitters, and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis via the thermogenic hypothesis. All very scientific sounding, but if nothing else, if you just remember that exercise induces the release of neurotransmitters and endorphins, will help you to associate exercise with great mental health. So back to Tommy, my son. After exhausting the conventional medical system with no improvement of symptoms, I continued on with my research and eventually found a naturopath and herbalist that has specialized in IBS and digestive disorders for the past 15 years. So we'll be doing a complete mapping and profile of his microbiome to find out what pathogenic microorganisms may be present and what the different levels of beneficial bacteria are across the different genre of species. Every individual is most likely going to be deficient or overpopulated in microbes across the full spectrum. And so it really does require a tailored approach according to the profile of your microbiome. Herbal antimicrobials will be used to kill the pathogenic ones, and specific probiotics will be used to supplement deficient populations. Studies have found a distinct imbalance in the microbiota of people with IBS had decreased counts of bifidobacteria, increased levels of Clostridia, SPP, a decrease of coliforms, lactobacilli and bifidobacteria, reduced bacterioids, and a twofold increase in the ratio of firmicutes to bacteroid depths. So I'll let you know how that goes when we get the results through. So apart from gastroinfections, such as food poisoning, other factors that may disrupt your gut microbiota include antibiotics. The use of antibiotics is by far the most common and significant cause of gut dysbiosis. The alteration and disruption of normal levels of flora caused by antibiotics has been known for a long time. Antibiotics do this by inviting a secondary infection by harmful yeasts and pathogenic bacteria to take hold. Antibiotics kill all kinds of bacteria, both good and bad. Studies have shown that by taking a single course of antibiotics, you can lose the biodiversity and balance of your gut flora within as little as 3 to 4 days. Another study that was carried out showing that the use of a broad spectrum antibiotic was also linked to the development of irritable bowel syndrome. Poor diet is another cause. Not enough prebiotic fiber to provide food for the probiotics, and so the microbial activity dies off. We need the fiber from those fruit and veggies to feed our great microbial population. Sugar is also a great source of food for the pathogenic bacteria. So when they have a good environment to grow and thrive, it throws off the balance in the microbiome. Chronic stress, as we discussed, the release of stress hormones and other chemicals will also disrupt that balance. Medications such as the protein pump inhibitors, they inhibit certain antibacterial secretions in the gut, like gastric acid, pancreatic juices, and bile, which keep bacterial growth in check. So if these acids are artificially inhibited, the acidity level isn't going to be high enough to kill the pathogenic bacteria, which can lead to an overgrowth of bad bacteria in the small intestines, known as SIBO, which stands for small intestinal bacteria overgrowth. So if you know of anyone who is suffering from one of these conditions that we've mentioned here, or you want to help prevent others from going down this track, don't forget to share this episode with them so that they can start on their own journey in addressing the underlying cause. And if you're interested in having support along the way, there is also my monthly coaching membership called Mind Scholars, where I teach and coach you on health and wellness, as well as weight loss, given how interconnected our physical health is with our mind, plus a whole host of other topics that we coach on and study in depth. You can learn more about that over at themindmanual.com/join. Have a beautiful week, everyone. Don't forget, get lots of exercise and eat all the colors of the rainbow. Chat to you soon.